Now, an important category of drugs that we cover here in class, and people in this class usually find this information surprising, is about dietary supplements. So if you look at the examples there in that photo, when we walk into our local, maybe our Target or our nutrition store here in Las Vegas, and we pull one of these products off the shelves, they look like over-the-counter medications, and we tend to assume that they are regulated in the same way as our over-the-counter and pharmaceutical and prescription-based pharmaceuticals. The reality is that this is not true. Dietary supplements are not subject to the same regulations as the other products that are monitored by the FDA. We do have a couple of basic restrictions in place. Back to purity, the label has to be honest about what's inside the package. So if they're going to say that it contains St. John's wort, then that's what needs to be in it. And they can't make unsubstantiated direct claims, like say St. John's wort. We can't claim that it treats depression. But if you look at the label on that package, what it says is that it provides support for positive mood balance. So that's different than saying that it treats depression. Okay, so that's a direct claim and an indirect claim. It can make that general claim that it's good for your mood. And then very important, especially if you consume a lot of supplements, is that you should realize that there's no safety testing for these products. Okay, so we talked about purity, effectiveness, and safety. The purity we've got, the effectiveness there's really no control over, and then safety, there's no clinical trial process for these substances. So a manufacturer can create a supplement, put it out there on the market, it can contain exactly what it says it does, and it can still be dangerous for your health. And that's why we see these they tend to be very well publicized recalls of supplement products. It goes out into the market, people take it, we see serious illness, sometimes we even see death, and then we see the product recalled off the market. So we're putting the product out there in the market first, and then we're playing catch up. So very important to realize if you're consuming supplements that they are not regulated and monitored by the FDA, and there's no clinical trial process in place to ensure your safety. So definitely something to be aware of if this is something that's a part of your life. Okay, so we talked about our legislative efforts to control legal drugs, so our pharmaceuticals. Now we're switching gears and we're talking more about those drugs that we've decided are illicit. So here we're going to start calling those controlled substances. So our very first federal effort here, 1914 Harrison Act, again we did see in local communities some earlier efforts, but the first time we saw federal legislation, the Harrison Act. And again, its purpose here is to start getting a piece of the action. It's going to be the federal government taxing this. But the enforcement arm at the time, the narcotics division, the way that they interpreted it, it actually led down the road to criminalization of drug use at a federal level. We started seeing physicians and pharmacists arrested for behavior that should have been taxable under the law. And what we really see here is a change of social norms that kind of culminates in the 18th Amendment, which kicked off prohibition. We see the legal consequences for dealing in illicit drugs become more and more serious throughout the 20th century. In 1922, we see the penalties double for dealing in illegal drugs. And another really interesting change that occurred over the 20th century is this dichotomy between prison versus rehabilitation for drug users. So in the 19th century in the United States, if you started taking those cocaine tooth drops, there was a strong possibility that you would become dependent on that substance. But in the 19th century, even here in the United States, we tended to view your dependence as something, as a medical condition. People were sympathetic, they offered you treatment options, there were places where you could go, like we consider now our rehab program, to help you get over that dependence. We didn't see it as a behavior that deserved punishment. And we still see this in place in the early 20th century, although of course we'll see that change over the course of that time period as well. Okay, so some more history of legislation about our drugs that we consider illicit here in the U.S. In 1930, we see the Treasury Department form a Bureau of Narcotics. So we see this role for enforcement at the federal level becoming more and more important. We've got our first ever drug czar, Harry Anslinger at the time, and he had a particular distaste for the use of marijuana. We'll talk more about that when we discuss marijuana later in the semester. But marijuana, same as the opium and cocaine efforts, our very first effort to control that was, again, through taxes. We're going to get some money out of it before we actually make it illegal. So that was in 1937. We see some updates on the penalties for drug use and manufacture and sale here in the United States in 1956. And then in 1965, we see new classes added to our list of controlled substances. So we see first effort is to collect some money from it. We're going to tax it. And then we see some minor penalties. We see the penalties become more serious, and then we see more drugs being added to this list. So really the trend throughout the 20th century, more drugs added to the category of controlled substances or illicit drugs, and more and tougher penalties for people who manufacture, sell, and use them. 1970, so getting close to the end of the 20th century, we see a major update to those laws, the Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act. So here we see all of the previous laws are replaced or updated by this piece of legislation. And we do start to see some conflicts between state and federal laws, basically either mostly on the severity of the penalties. So with this act, the federal government says that anything that is controlled by the act is now under federal jurisdiction. And here in the 21st century, as we're starting to see the cultural shift in perspectives on marijuana use, we're continuing to see that conflict between state and federal laws. We also see increased funding now, finally, for prevention and treatment. But at the same time, we do see increased funding for enforcement. So we're no longer trying to tax those drugs as of 1970. If we consider it a drug that's covered by the act, then it is illegal to be used. So they're all illicit, and we're no longer trying to use taxation as a tool. And an interesting trend that we see now is we see that separation from the scientific or medical perspective on dependence. We see that separated from the process of enforcement, and we continue to see the consequences of that when we talk about the prison population here in the United States. So when we talk about controlled substances, if you've ever heard the term Schedule 1, Schedule 3, Schedule 5, this is how that actually looks. So the schedules are categories for basically the level of danger for the drug. Schedule 1, the criteria here is that there's high potential for abuse. So folks who start using the drug are likely to become dependent, and no accepted medical use. So there's no real medical reason to use the drug, and then that there's a lack of accepted safety. Schedule 2, we still see that high potential for abuse, but we do have a currently accepted medical use. So just say maybe the contrast here between heroin and morphine. In the United States, you can still get a prescription for morphine. We see this sometimes used for pain management during end of life, but you're not going to get a prescription for heroin anywhere in the U.S. Ecstasy is also on this list. So you're not really going to get a prescription for a Schedule 1 drug. But of course, our second example there, marijuana, is going to be an interesting case here, right? Because we do know that we see the cultural landscape on marijuana use really changing in the United States at this time. So we'll talk a little bit more later in the semester about how marijuana ended up on the in the Schedule 1 category. As we move down through the list, we're going to see less potential for abuse and less concern about potential dependence as we move down through. So when we talk about a Schedule 5 drug, now we're talking about maybe a cough syrup with codeine, which many of us have taken throughout our lives. There is some potential for abuse, but it's fairly low. There's definitely a currently accepted medical use, but of all the scheduled drugs, we're least worried about the potential for abuse in that particular category. So that's the schedules and some examples of how which substances fit in which category.